Welcome to Abolition Democracy 913. Last session, we discussed the abolition of capital punishment. And of course, the death penalty is really the practice and the institution that for so many decades was most closely associated with the modern concept of abolition. Today, we're going to discuss prisons and prison abolition in conversation with Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete, from 2003, and the work of Allegra McLeod and Dwayne Betts. And of course, thanks to these extraordinary writings and to the militancy of Angela Davis and the members of the Critical Resistance and many others, prison abolition has now also become central to the abolitionist movement. This is new, I'd say. It's a phenomenon of the last few decades. And it's the product in part of the massive racialized increase in incarceration that this country experienced beginning around 1973. I know you're all familiar with the history and the statistics and the exponential increase in incarceration in this country, and of course, the millions of human lives that have been harmed by racialized mass incarceration. Today, the movement for prison abolition is really in conversation and in tension with movements to reform the prison. In the same way as we saw in Abolition Democracy 313 on Abolish the Police, that the movement to abolish and or defund the police is also in a conversation and in some tension with the movement to reform the police. And so we are today, I would say, within critical spaces, confronting abolition and reform. And of course, that's what makes Angela Davis's book so pertinent, so relevant, and so poignant, because of course, that's one of the ways in which she opens her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? When she asks, what does it mean for an institution like the prison, founded on the very notion of reforming the delinquent, to constantly be defective, deficient, or deviant itself, and to constantly be in need of reform? How should we think about an institution like the prison that exists in a constant state of needing to be reformed? That's how, in part, she opens the book on page 40, where she writes, it is ironic that the prison itself was a product of concerted efforts by reformers to create a better system of punishment. If the words prison reform so easily slip from our lips, it is because prison and reform have been inextricably linked since the beginning of the use of imprisonment as the main means of punishing those who violate social norms. And Angela Davis points here as well to the work of Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, and this famous passage on page 234, where Foucault makes this point also about the relationship between the prison and reform, right? Where he writes, prison reform is virtually contemporary with the prison itself. It constitutes, as it were, its program. From the outset, the prison was caught up in a series of accompanying mechanisms whose purpose was apparently to correct it, but which seemed to form part of its very functioning. So closely have they been bound up with its existence throughout its long history. So the prison, an institution of reform, in a constant state of reform, because it never ever seems even reformed to accomplish its objectives. And how long do we continue down that path? We're becoming familiar today with many of the debates about reform versus abolition, the recurring arguments that are being made. But our purpose today is really to dig in a little bit deeper and discuss and think this evening about that relationship. And so to kick us off, we have two extraordinary critical thinkers, Dwayne Betts and Allegra McLeod. And I'm really thrilled to have both Dwayne and Allegra on with me. So, and welcome. Let me introduce Dwayne Betts and also Allegra McLeod. feel free to turn on your videos and come on and join us. Reginald Dwayne Betts is a poet, a memoirist, a writer, an artist, a lawyer, a teacher, and a brilliant thinker. He's the inventor and director of the Million Book Project, which is an amazing effort to curate time capsules of 500 books and to send them out to thousands of prisons and juvenile detention centers around the country. I'd say, Dwayne, that you are a Renaissance man in many senses of the term, but especially in the way in which you combine so many dimensions of human excellence. Everyone here is familiar with your poetry and with your award-winning book of poetry titled Felon. Here, let me just share the cover quickly here, which is an extraordinary collection of poems, of course, with accolades and awards from the New York Times all the way to the NAACP. It's been exceptionally well received, and it is truly an incredible work of art and poetry. You have collaborated intensely with the visual artist, Titus Kafar, whose artwork is actually on the cover of Felon. And your collaborations led most recently to your poem and artwork titled The Redaction, and to your exhibition of those prints at MoMA PS1. A graduate of Yale Law School and also perhaps a graduate of maximum security prisons. Your work in public defense, your work in advocacy, and your years behind bars as a teenager give you, I think, a really unique perspective to speak about the current criminal legal ordeal and ideas for change. We've all read your most recent careful and deep essay published in the New York Times Magazine titled Kamala Harris, Mass Incarceration and Me. And I really welcome you to this public seminar without any expectations placed in any way on you regarding your views and thoughts. So thanks for joining us, Dwayne.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. My pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
Thanks. And I'm also delighted to welcome Allegra McLeod. Allegra McLeod is a professor at Georgetown University and a brilliant critical theorist. And it's fair to say that Allegra, in a way, shattered a barrier for us by publishing one of the first, if not the first, law review article in a law review that presented to a lawyerly audience prison abolition. And that was her groundbreaking article in 2015 titled Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice, which appeared in the UCLA Law Review. And of course, everyone's read that for today's session. And, you know, as with all groundbreaking work, it now feels normal. But at the time, only 6 years ago, you know, I assure you all, it made significant waves. It was a formidable, novel intervention that shook us all. And I think that's true in part of, you know, of Angela Davis's work and the work of critical resistance, maybe even what we were doing at EJI 30 years ago. I mean, it seems normal at the time. It seems normal today, but back then it was really shattering barriers. Allegra also, before entering the academy, practiced immigration and criminal law at the California-Mexico border, first as an Arthur Lyman Public Interest Fellow, and then as a staff attorney with the ABA Immigration Justice Project, which was an organization that she helped to create. So thanks so much for joining us as well, Allegra. It's great to have you back in conversation.
Thanks so much.
So let me just quickly chat out what we're going to do. We're going to start first in conversation with Dwayne Betts to talk about some of his recent artwork, because I think we need that larger perspective in order to properly set the stage for a conversation this evening. After we've spoken with Dwayne about recent artwork, I'll then ask Allegra to present some thoughts about abolition, prison abolition. Then I'll ask Dwayne Betts to present some of his thoughts on the prison, and then we'll have a roundtable of thoughts and reactions from other panelists who've been joining us for other sessions. Hopefully everybody will be on. We'll have Jocelyn Simonson, who's a professor here at Columbia Law School, and Jindu Obiofuma, who joined us for 113 and is at the Justice Lab here at Columbia, and Alexis Hogue, who's also a professor here at Columbia Law School, and Ivan Khalaf, who is a Justice and Education Fellow and previous panelist, and hopefully Amna Akbar can join us as well. So, and then we'll have a bit of a roundtable response and reaction, and then we'll open up to questions from everyone who can turn on their videos or ask questions in the question and answer session. So, all right, Dwayne, let's start. And I really did want to start with the artwork, because I think that it's such an important dimension of your thought and of your writings and of your thoughts on the prison that I thought we should try and start there.
That sounds good.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
Good.
I will say, I guess I'll say a few things and then I'll go through some slides.
Yeah.
I think I should say this though, right? Like as a poet, I think one of the things that's sort of fundamentally different from the role of the poet, and people disagree with me, but fundamentally different. As a poet, the role that I imagine is it's like a different kind of truth, a kind of truth that demands complexity, a kind of truth that demands that we confront real challenges, and a kind of truth that demands that I do it in everything I say about prison. And so I don't do it when it's convenient, just when it's convenient, and I don't do it in private. I do it in everything I say about prison. I came home, 2005, and on some humble shit, I was invited to speak at a friend's, Johanna McCant. She was a PhD student at University of Maryland at the time. Now she's a professor, and she gotten her PhD. But she invited me to speak to her students, and I said, "Why would you invite me to speak to your students?" And she was like, "Well, you're an artist, you're a poet, and you got something to say about prison that most people don't." And I said, you sure? Like, I literally just came home like 26 days ago, and I went to speak. And Liz Ryan was there, and Liz Ryan was starting a new organization called the Campaign for Youth Justice, and the entire organization was premised on stopping juveniles from being tried as adults. And Liz heard me speak, and she asked me if I would, speak at a couple of events. And I spoke at an event, and then I spoke at another one, and then I spoke at another one. And the first lesson I learned was that all of these advocates who wanted me to speak about why it was horrible to most of these advocates who wanted me to speak about why it was horrible to send juveniles to prison with adults, they never wanted me to say the crime I was convicted of. And I realized that, like, for them, the justice they wanted demanded me presenting myself in a way that was fully and completely a lie. And I start with that because a poet is not supposed to tell a lie. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run through some of the artwork from the redaction project. And I want you to think about that artwork through the lens of what I imagine myself to be as a poet. And then I'm gonna talk about some other artwork that is related and how I imagine the other artwork that is related presents a really different kind of complicated challenge that, again, I just think people fundamentally don't want to talk about. And it's evidenced by so much of the conversations within the literary community who, around mass incarceration, but it's also like just evidenced against the public conversation about it. We talking about abolition, and it's a bunch of people that's upset because a man who was convicted of possessing child pornography and who did time in prison, they got articles in the Guardian and other magazines about the fact that he shouldn't be allowed to publish poetry. I don't even understand how we could have a conversation about abolition when we also have articles saying that a man could be able to publish a poem and get paid $250 because of the crime that he committed that he already served time for. But
right. That's been going on just now, right? That form of censorship is an ongoing. But it's interesting how you just started, because, of course, as I was trying to figure out how to present you, right? I did notice that in a lot of your materials, right up front, it's clear that you were 16 years old, you had a gun, and you did a carjacking. Is the way that you present yourself in a way, and I didn't do that just now, and of course I could have. So tell me just a little bit about that. Right.
Well, I think right. I mean, I think so. I think it depends on what the conversation is. If so, for instance, had I been the editor of a special issue on mass incarceration, I would feel that it's the need to talk about my stance on everybody that's incarcerated and why I think it's important not to Google people, not to ask people what crimes they were convicted of, or that they committed, because I think that we should live in a space in which we don't hold that over people's heads forever.
Mhm.
But I feel like I need to say it because it is important for somebody to be willing to say, you don't just get to think about me as a Yale Law student. We act as if the movement that we're a part of now is one is huge, but two, it's ever present. I remember writing the ACLU in 1998 saying that there is a kid here who was 18 years old, got locked up when he was 16, got convicted of a crime that was not a rape, a murder, or a robbery in which nobody was hurt, and he was sentenced to 60 years. Will you do something about it?
Mhm.
And the ACLU said, no, this is not our issue. And so the ACLU doesn't get today to act like that was the issue. They don't get today to act like they on the vanguard. No, they get to give a written apology, just like the CO has to give a written apology, just like the warden has to give a written apology. And so I introduced myself as a felon, as a convict, as somebody who put a pistol to somebody's head, because when I went to these fine and august institutions, they always remembered that shit.
Mhm.
Every single institution I applied to remembered it, and they asked me to account for it. Professors, brilliant folks, they always want to know, well, what did you do again?
Mhm.
And so I say it because I think it's important that somebody says it. And
Mhm.
and I think, and as I've run through these images, you'll see I will again address why I say it.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
so
Yeah. And when you do though, I just want to know, I just want to make sure it's not because other people want to know, right? It's not because right, there's more to it than that. There's got to be more to it than that. It's not because other people are curious or use it as a way to kind of frame you,
it's
right?
not even that other people are curious. I want other people to have to confront it. I want other people to have values that meet their rhetoric.
Mhm.
If I choose not to say it, then their values aren't forced to meet their rhetoric.
Mhm.
It's not like, I mean, I'm not going to say it every time I see you. I'm not going to say it every time I meet you. I
Mhm.
haven't told all of my classmates, but I know every time Howard University full tuition scholarship snatched from me because I got a felony.
Mhm.
So I'm supposed to experience that and live with that, and then not put it out there in the public and ask us how we're going to account for this.
Mhm.
I think that would be like hypocritical, and it would allow institutions that continue to stigmatize people to keep doing so. It was like letting somebody praise me because now they think I'm praiseworthy, and not have them admit all of the times in which I wasn't. But I also think it's more complicated than that, which I'll get into when I show you the last run of these slides. So right now I'm sharing. I didn't know you were going to show folks my book cover. I wanted to show folks my book cover and to say something about the name Felon. It's called Felon, mainly because I ain't. It's like it's like Bernie Mac used to be like, I ain't afraid of you motherfuckers. And that's how he used to start his comedy set, right? It's like, I'm not afraid, man. Every time I apply for a job, I got to say that I've been convicted of a felony. Every time I apply to a university, every university I've applied to, it has come up. And then people act like, Dwayne, why do you say that? You shouldn't use the word felon. It stigmatizes you. No, you stigmatize me. The word doesn't stigmatize me. America stigmatizes me. And so I wanted to write a book that argued that what felon does, what that word does, is erase so much of what our identities are. And so I use Titus Kafar's pieces because it's a perfect example of that. Somebody said, Dwayne, that's so cool that you want to cover. An early iteration only had one image, and it was like, it's so cool that they put that you put yourself on the cover. And it was this one right here with the naughty head.
Okay.
Don't
Okay.
don't look nothing like me, right? And anyway, eyewitness identifications are always suspect. And you looking at this and you asserting it's me for what reason? And then I thought, oh, you know what? I need to put 4 images on it because people won't get the point. If it's only one image, they'll just imagine it's me. And what I want to say something about is how this whole experience attempts to redact all of our relationships and all of our
Mhm.
humanity.
Mhm. But on those, the level, if you just go back, the level of the way in which it is dipped in tar is a reflection of the number of years. Is it
Yeah,
there's a relationship? What is it? How does that
yeah,
work?
Yeah, so it becomes both a metaphor for the number of years. If you looked at, this is from the Jerome Project. So if you looked at the Jerome Project, it is 99 of these. and it's very varying degrees of the amount of the portrait that's dipped in tar. But it's two things though, because you could do 3 years in prison consumes you. So it's both a metaphor for the amount of time you've done, but it's also a metaphor for how much of a burden the time you did has become on your life. So
Mhm.
in some real sense, if it was my image dipped in tar, it might just cover the gray of my beard. But it depends on how you think about what incarceration has done to my life. I mean, my life literally is, 70% of the things I say publicly about prison, which means that the experience of prison has fundamentally consumed my existence in ways that are troubling and depressing and inescapable. And so, in some sense, that even if you tried to measure it out by the time I served, that wouldn't even be a true reflection of the effect that incarceration has had on my life.
Mhm.
Um, but so yeah, I think the metaphor works a couple of different ways. And if you see the whole 99 redaction run, I mean, Jerome Project run, you'll kind of see how it operates in multiple levels.
Mhm.
So I went to law school, and one of the things about law school is it is a language that is different. But I remember getting these cases that Alec Kirkistanis and the Civil Rights Court were working on, and being really impressed by two things. One, that you could sue a city for locking people up that shouldn't be locked up, for locking people up for traffic tickets, for locking people up because they were poor. And I was also impressed by how the language actually really got at what somebody might say if they were if they were allowed to speak.
Mhm.
One of the first things a professor told me when I went to law school was I was in a class and they said law school is where poets go to die. I was the only poet in the room, and I was
Mm, mm,
devastated.
mm.
I was
That's powerful.
devastated
Oof,
by the
oof,
declaration.
mm,
I went up to him afterward. I was like, I'm a poet. And he turned beet red, and he was kind of like, I didn't really mean it that way. I was like, yeah, you did, but it's cool. And so I was in law school, and I was really thinking about how to the whole time, how do you not um become diminished as an artist because of what you're learning about the law. And so this case made me think, what if I could turn this into a poem? And it's a long history of redaction poems and erasure poems, but usually you erase a document to make it say what you want to say. You make it become ironic. But I wanted to like redact these pieces, and I wanted to use the word redaction because typically redaction is used to say this is above your pay grade. And I wanted to use the word redaction and say, no, I'm getting rid of what's superfluous. And so I did it. And first, I turned them into poems. I turned an 80-page court lawsuit into a 4-page poem, a 5-page poem, an 8-page poem. And so this is the first page. And I thought it was visually arresting because it signaled and clued in that it was a lawsuit. But the language, plaintiffs, impoverished, jailed by the city, unable to pay traffic tickets, pay or sit in jail. $50 per day, plaintiffs unable to pay, each sent to jail. Told they could work off debts, $25 per day, clean in the city, scrubbing feces and blood from jail floors. I thought that this in itself was an indictment, and
mm.
it was laying plain what actually is happening. And I
Right.
thought it was beautiful, and I thought it was poetic. And so I did this with several pieces.
And
And
it is so, I mean, sorry to interrupt. I mean, it is so powerful also in the way you read it. And it's like if we actually saw the document with all of the, legal language that kind of turns it into this mumbo jumbo, it'd be so different, right?
yeah, and that was the point. That was the superfluous part of it. That was the so that all that's left to script bear is the voice of people.
Mhm.
And so, but then I was like, how do you get the voice of people? How do you convey that? And so one way to convey that is I was working with Titus and we was like, well, let's make it art. And it's he etched images, right? And we was thinking about just like in the Jerome project, he was thinking about the mugshot and he was thinking about this sort of really effective classic portraiture, right? That's used to condemn folks.
Mhm.
And so he wanted to etch these images and make them beautiful, but then he would drop them. He would drop two etchings on one, so that if you look closely, like on this one, you could see two sets of ears. And it's suggesting that to actually know who this person is, you got to look closely and actually see it's not just one person, it's two. And the clue is always in the eyes. And if you look closely, you can see it. But see, what happens is if you're a felon, people don't look closely at you anymore. And so we wanted to create art that demanded that you look closely at what was there and recognize the beauty in the thing that was there. And so this is so I'm gonna go through a few of these, and then there's one other image that's just slightly different, and I'll talk about the difference in that, and then I'll talk about how this spun into something else. So this is just another image, and all of these guys are different, but you know what happens is looking at their faces, it becomes a combination of like sometimes it's rage, sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's anger, and for me, it's humbling to see how much that can be expressed in the eyes and the ghosting of the eyes. Um, and so when we did this, we showed it at the at MoMA PS1, and we had them like 50 prints all across the wall, and you could go, and these poems read as uh as like linked units, right? So each case becomes one poem, but each print also becomes its own thing, almost like a haiku. Because what I wanted you to do was like get the whole of a single story every time you looked at one print. And as men and as women, and as some people who we went and took photos of. Uh, this one in particular, I know I went and I interviewed these folks, and I took that picture, and it's really arresting because it's a woman, and we took a picture of her daughter too. And
On this one, there's no, you redacted it all.
I didn't redact it all. I just, when we made the print, I pulled the words out. So we made diptychs, and then the next one you'll see it more clearly. But what we did is, it's something about the things that's superfluous entrap us. And so here the redaction lines almost end up, visually representing bars, representing the things that allow us not to break free. And that's all of the legalese that was sort of basically meaningless. That, well, not meaningless, but not as meaningful as the things that I felt like I kept. And so that's also trying to make a statement about the way in which sometimes the law um, really, imprisons us. Same thing here. Same thing here. But then, so when you look at this one, you have the words and the lines that were redacted separated, so you could actually see, and you can see what happens, and it creates a diptych.
Right.
And then finally, here it does the same thing, and it's almost like a map, though. But it's almost like a brutal map, like a word map of what a person is. It's like this is how we think about people. This is what people get reduced to. This is what the state reduces is and I thought this was a wild line that you would never find and like really in a public conversation. The practice to jail indigent, the practice to hold prisoners indefinitely, the practice to issue invalid warrants, to threaten, to hold arrestees in jail arbitrarily, to confine people in grotesque, dangerous, and inhumane conditions, a Kafkaesque journey, a lawless and libertine scheme of perpetual debt. And to see that, which comes off as a word map, but you see who's like looking at that, I think it becomes to me it becomes like stunning. And kudos to Alec and his team for being willing to use the word Kafkaesque.
Yeah, right.
And also, like, who does that?
Yeah.
And then so finally, this is the last image. So what happens is I'm working on this project, and you got these lawsuits, and I wrote the book, and I think guys I knew who were locked up in my book, but their representation was like all in prison, and even in the redaction prints, the representation is like of really the voice of people speaking about the experience of prison. But what does it mean to not be in prison? And so I wanted to take the clothes of friends of mine. I got them to send me their sweats, and they send me sweatpants. And the sweats will represent, when they first got them, first got the sweats. I'm gonna cut this off. When they first got the sweats, they would be like what you wore to be fly on the yard. Then it'll become what you slept in. Then it will become what you exercised in. And I got friends of mine who was doing 10, 15, 20 years in prison, been locked up for most of their lives. Most of them had life sentences. I got I got them to send me their sweats, and I turned it into paper. And so that last image was me making paper, and this is the paper that we made. And the sweats, it makes a kind of beautiful, really almost sculptural piece of handmade paper.
Mm.
And I made the paper, and we had it in exhibit two. But the point was, I wanted a representation of who they were outside of prison to exist on the walls of this gallery, right?
Mhm.
I wanted their life to exist on the walls of the gallery, and it was, and I've been representing them the whole time, really, ever since I was in law school. One of the, I thought I was going to law school to become a public defender, but I got into law school and realized that I had to get my friends out. Like, what does it mean? What does abolition really mean? And it means different things for everybody. But for me, part of what all of this means is getting people that I know out of prison, like to use the skills that I've obtained to get people out of prison, to tell the narratives of people who should not be in prison. But those clothes, my man Luke had a murder case. He had a robbery case, but some people might say it was felony murder, depending on what state he was in. But he had a robbery case, and during the robbery, his cousin got killed, and they sentenced him to life for robbery.
Mhm.
And his cousin got killed by somebody they tried to rob. So literally, they gave him life just because of the pain and suffering he caused to the victim who had to murder his cousin to try to protect his property. So he sent me his clothes. My man Juvie sent me his clothes. He killed two people, and he had life and some change.
Mhm.
My man Star sent me his clothes. He got a body.
Mhm.
He had like he had 35 years.
Mhm.
Fat sent me his clothes. He had 53 years, but he had a murder that he didn't commit. And, I had their clothes, and I was like, this kind of ain't enough. And I started working. I always been working to get them out, but it's just that things came to a head. And in fact, it was this time last year, February last year, that I went to talk to the chair of the parole board in Virginia to advocate for the release of Fats on a conditional pardon and Juvie on parole. And Juvie came home, so that was February. Juvie came home in May, and then Fats came home in July. And then I represented my man Luke too, and he came home and put a word in for his co-defendant. His co-defendant came home too, and it was like it was cool. But then Juvie died, and he came home in May, died in December. Some shit he didn't know he had, disease he probably carried around the whole time he was in prison. And I had the stack of prison paper, and I was like, what do you do with this? I mean, like I had this representation of them inside, but not of them free, and particularly a juvie. And I had all these letters like this. You buy legal pads in prison. That's what you write on. So I had all these letters, stacks and stacks of letters dating back, 10, 15 years from when I was out. And I sent all the prison paper with the letters to this artist named Kyoko Ibe, Japanese artist. And she took the she took the paper and she did her thing. Her artwork it consists of like floating dust and dirt and paint and different things on the handmade paper, but also floating letters. And so I sent her all the letters, and she put so this was crazy, right? Because this is she didn't know. So one, the Japanese text um is from like 11th century um records that she came across of a civilization that no longer exists. And she floated some of that in there to talk about history and to talk about how we create a lasting legacy. But I sent her letters of all my folks, and she floated this in here, and this is Juvie's handwriting, and it's the address of the parole board the first time he asked me to represent him. And she, I mean, she don't know that. She has no idea the address of the parole board. It's kind of amazing that out of all of the pages I sent her, she picked that out and floated it. But I don't know. I think one of the things I want to say is, this is like I imagine it as like a kite. It's like a way to try to embrace freedom and a way to create some art that embodies something more than incarceration. But what's interesting for me, and I think I'll end here, is that every conversation I've had with all of the people that I know and I've done time with is deeply steeped in what it means to come to grips with the harm that folks have caused, and to come to grips with what it means to know that, like, freedom is a necessity. And those are the arguments that I have. I remember one time somebody found out about the Million Book Project on the internet, and this person's response, who doesn't know me, was like, "But what are you doing to get people out of prison?" She was like, "Books. Books don't matter. I mean, what are you doing to get people out of prison?"
Mm,
And I was like, "Everything I do is working to get people out of prison. It ain't as grand and ambitious as a political theory, frankly. I'm like
mm,
super self-interested.
mm,
I try to get people out of prison who I shared meals with.
mm,
That is what I do, and that is the abolition that I fundamentally believe in and work for."
mm. Thanks so much, Dwayne. I mean, as you were talking, it was fascinating the way you mentioned that you going to law school and then thinking you were going to be a defender or something, and then realizing that the path is a different direction. It's kind of from the friends to working with them, and it's kind of interesting because many of us who came from the other direction in a way that's it's this relationship between it's this relationship between actually critique and praxis that is fascinating here, because it's what guides your work is your friendships, and what's funny, or I see it kind of inverted, in the case for many of us who public defenders or death row lawyers, is like you start on the law side, you start with the case, and then you develop the friendship. And I think, though, that whether you start on your side or whether you start on the other side, I think you end up in the same place, which is that, these are my friends. I mean, as a lawyer, you're not supposed to, you're supposed to keep certain barriers and whatnot, which of course you're coming from a different place, so you don't have those restrictions, you don't have those limitations. But I think even despite that, you kind of throw that away after a while. And it's just like, no, the phone call's coming from your friend. I mean, it's coming from my friend too. You know what I mean? Earlier
Right.
today, it's like, you know, we've been we've been close 30 years now on that case that was calling today. You know what I mean? And it's like it's more about a friend than it is about anything else, right? Um, so it's
Yeah, I think that's
interesting.
true. I think that's true. I don't know if I think it's true for everybody, but I do think that is true for the people who. I think it's true for enough of us that I got real faith. But I never forget when I was trying to get somebody to represent a friend who, and the person was like, it's just bad facts. And I
Yeah.
man,
Yeah.
and facts, he got a pardon, but the truth is, like, and he was innocent, but the truth is every habeas that the Innocence Project, the VA filed, got denied.
Yeah, right. Well,
It's
yeah.
like these real limitations of law, and I think so. Anyway, I think that what you just
In-
said is true for the best of us, but I think a lot of us are so caught up in what the law says that these folks aren't our friends. We don't know them. I mean, I fundamentally think that if people who even were asking me to speak about some of these issues were my friends, then they would never ask me not to answer the question. They would never say, when somebody asks you what you were locked up for,
mm,
pivot to a talking point. Like, who the fuck
mm.
you think you talking to?
Right.
Like,
But that has
what
to do
language
with,
is that?
right. That also has to do with something about innocence, right? It's kind of the perils of innocence. And actually, Fonda Shen, who's running the center, is writing a really brilliant thesis on this. But it's the fact that things need supposedly, or people think it needs to be sanitized in some way, or clean, or innocence. And that's, and so much of the discourse, about even abolition often is distorted in that way, I would say, because it's like, we're not, everybody's innocent. That's not
But
the sine qua non of empathy or something.
but you also but I take it that you agree with this too. It's not even just innocence, right? It's also safety. I ain't guaranteeing you're gonna be safe if you let JoJo out of prison. He
Yeah, right,
robs people. He might rob you tomorrow.
right.
Like the reason why he shouldn't be in prison has very little to do with the fact that the community is going to be safer.
Right.
And I think that we've created safety also as another proxy for innocence. And so we have all of these statistics that suggest like, well, once you hit the age 30, the likelihood that you're going to commit another crime is dramatically reduced. And it's like, but wait a minute, how can we have a conversation about what we believe is okay for us to do as people to others in this society? It's
Right.
not predicated. I mean, I think my guy's not going to commit another crime, but when I'm arguing for why they should be free, I mean, my whole dilemma is how to make that case without um it's almost impossible, but it's like how to make that case to a parole board, how to make that case to the public
Right.
without being so deeply invested in
Right.
things that we frankly cannot ascertain, because that is my real dilemma. I didn't expect to commit another crime when I came home, but it was nothing that predict that I wouldn't.
Mhm.
Especially with all of the doors that got slammed in my face, especially with all of the opportunities that got stripped from me, with all of the apartments that I couldn't live in, with all of the like people who I respected who would say things to me like, "Well, you aren't going to live on campus, are you?" As if somehow my proximity to the quarters of the undergraduate students was an indicator of whether or not I was likely to be violent. And these were like progressives. These people who would tell you, who 100% wholeheartedly agree with everything we say about abolition, who looked at me in my face and said, "Well, you aren't going to live in the dorms, are you?"
Mm, mm,
And so I think yes, it is it's the perils of innocence, but I
mm,
also think it's the perils of our the false notion that that we could in any like meaningful way ascertain the likelihood of somebody committing a violent crime, or if the ability to do that is the reason why somebody should be free.
mhm, mhm.
Because I just don't think that, I mean, I personally don't think that that's the metric. And so much of the conversation suggests that that's the metric. So many of the things I say to the parole board suggests that that's the metric.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if that's, I don't know how I don't know how that's, how new that is. I mean, that would be something, it would be something really important to explore. The risk society, or the notion of risk, is something that, came, I mean, a lot has been written, fascinating work, François Evald and others, on the way in which risk becomes a category that dominates our thinking about society. And it starts actually towards the end of the uh, 19th century, with actually things like workmen's compensation schemes, which are kind of risk analyses. But it does seem somehow that um, the idea of trying to achieve a society of zero risk, that effort, I don't know. It feels newer to me. And maybe this is just a romantic vision of the past, but it seems as if there was more of a conception that, well, in society there are risks. I mean, that's just, it's going to happen. Things are going to happen, and that we didn't want to structure it in the same way. I don't know. That must be a romantic vision of the past, but I agree entirely that this notion of kind of zero risk, or zero tolerance, etc., which that traces pretty much back to the 80s and the 90s, and definitely zero tolerance in the broken windows context, etc. But there is that way in which not being willing to take any risk is what is so punitive, right? It's so it doesn't allow. It feels as if it doesn't allow for a normal social existence in a way, and just as you were talking about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, all right. Well, that was powerful artwork, particularly as you were reading it, Dwayne. Powerful artwork. Thanks so much for sharing that with us, and for sharing your thoughts in this way, which really sets the stage, I think, beautifully for our discussion today. Um, and congratulations on that work.
Thank you.
So, Allegra, um, you've been doing brilliant work for a number of years now on these topics, both with that kind of groundbreaking piece back in 2015, and then you've been really continuing to mine and think about this with the newer piece, which we put on the blog in the Harvard Law Review, on realizing abolition democracy. So I was hoping that you could maybe intervene and give us your thoughts, and particularly where you are now on this project of imagining an abolitionist horizon.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for including me, for that very generous introduction, and for your own work. And thank you, Dwayne, for your really tremendous, brilliant, and deep writing and the artwork you shared with us, and for helping us hold on to complexity and contradiction. And I'm looking forward to talking more about that work in the course of our conversation. I also wanted to thank two amazing Georgetown law students, Aram Kidwai and Saba Rowald, who are joining the Zoom call and who helped me in thinking about some of the project that I'll share with you this evening. And it's really good to be with all of you on the call, even in this strange Zoom world in our little boxes. Wanted to share some slides in opening my remarks. And I'd like to explore with you tonight something unfolding in this painful but also transformative time that we're living through, that relates to a question that Dwayne posed a moment ago, and that is, what is abolition? So on the one hand, abolitionist ideas and organizing are inspiring new movements and widespread excitement in this moment. But abolition is also entering public and academic discourse in ways that misapprehend, distort, and misappropriate the abolitionist project. Some of these new appropriations of abolition have lost the long-standing and, I believe, inextricable connections between abolition and the Black radical, feminist, indigenous, queer, anti-capitalist, and liberatory commitments. I'd like to focus on this tension. On the one hand, the flourishing of abolitionist projects over the last several years with indigenous, Black radical, and feminist leadership. And on the other hand, the increasing invocation of the rhetoric of abolition to advance long-standing familiar initiatives as cutting edge by drawing on the momentum of recent mass movements for racial justice and abolition. As the decades-long efforts of abolitionists open new possibilities and draw in new audiences, it's worth recalling that abolition is not a call to reduce racialized violence of prisons or policing in favor of more humane punishment, more social spending, and alternative first responders. Instead, abolitionists have long sought to build new forms of genuinely egalitarian coexistence, radically reimagined and more just economic, political, and social systems that are decolonial, anti-capitalist, and feminist. Thanks to the work of Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Rachel Hertzing, Dylan Rodriguez, Miriam Caba, the organizers of Critical Resistance, BYP 100, the Red Nation, Mi Gente, among many others, more people are coming to recognize the white supremacist violence and illegitimacy of our prison and policing regimes and the economic and social orders these regimes maintain in place. In the face of an increased openness to abolition, it's important, though, to identify the promise of this radical abolitionist world-making project, but also, I think, to be mindful of the misappropriations of the rhetoric of abolition towards ends that tend to reinforce rather than challenge our current state and status quo. For example, the most recent annual review of criminology features Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, a professor at Yale and director of the Center for Policing Equity, who writes that abolition, and I quote, is simply a call to abolish the racist mission of policing and empower those tasked with maintaining public safety with a different one, end quote. In order for cities, states, and the nation to approach this project of abolition, Dr. Goff proposes expanding options beyond fire, medical, and law enforcement first responders. The piece ends with Dr. Goff imagining what he would do if he was appointed chief of a major city's police department, and he focuses primarily on listening more to those who are policed. So some of these may be worthwhile goals. For example, working to eliminate overtly racist policing tactics and especially brutal prison conditions are worthwhile goals, but this project is not reflective of the abolitionist vision located in the Black radical and anti-colonial traditions. These invocations of abolition also appear in the mainstream press. For instance, in the midst of mass demonstrations this summer following the murder of George Floyd, the Washington Post published an editorial assuring readers that abolition is, quote, not as scary or even as radical as it sounds, end quote. Be not afraid, the author, who also directs a prominent university center involved in police training, writes, quote, "Defunding and abolition probably means something different from what you are thinking," end quote. The editorial goes on to describe abolition in terms of shrinking the scope of police responsibilities, shifting most of what government does to keep us safe to entities that are better equipped to meet that need. And the author suggests this project is called Abolition because it reminds us that policing has long been a means of racialized social control. Quote, "That aspect of policing must be literally abolished," end quote. These efforts reduce abolition to an alternative approach to promoting public safety that holds at its center the concern with risk, for instance, that Dwayne was just speaking skeptically of, which retains a primary role for the criminal legal system, though somehow cleansed of racial bias. On this approach, certain problems like homelessness or mental illness could be addressed by social workers and other entities rather than police and prisons. This appropriation of an abolitionist agenda is in some sense reminiscent of the increasing interest in decarceration and prison reform, the abolition reform tension that Bernard noted in his introductory remarks. This, of course, this kind of widespread interest in decarceration resulted in widely criticized alliances between the Koch Foundation, Newt Gingrich, Jared Kushner, and liberal progressive organizations like the NAACP. An abolitionist visionary, author, and organizer Miriam Kaba wrote several years ago of what she described as this increasing vogue, as she put it, of prison reform. "What a strange moment we're in," she says. "Prison reform is in vogue." As someone who has devoted years of her life, Kaba writes, to the work of reforming and then later abolishing prisons, one might think that I would be excited about recent developments. In fact, my natural skepticism is now at its peak, mainly because I'm a student of history. The prison was born out of a reform movement, and since its inception in the US in the late 18th century, we've been tinkering towards imperfection. With every successive call for reform, the prison has remained stubbornly brutal, violent, and inhumane. And again, resonating with some of Bernard's opening remarks, Professor Dylan Rodriguez cautions that liberal to progressive reformism attempts to protect and sustain the institutional and cultural political coherence of an existing system by adjusting and or refurbishing it. And he suggests, by contrast, abolitionism addresses the historical roots of that system in relations of oppressive, continuous, and asymmetrical violence. The question that I'm posing now, though, is what is abolition? And I want to continue to explore the distinct tension now between these divergent meanings and invocations of abolition as distinct from reform by saying a bit more about the radical foundations and possibilities of abolitionist praxis. And then I'll turn to another illustration of the way that abolition is being appropriated to promote police and prison training programs. And I'll begin to explore the radical entailments of abolition by engaging a question that's often posed to prison abolitionists. And that question is, what about the so-called murderers and rapists? What about the so-called murderers and rapists? First, we have to consider who are the murderers and rapists. Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolitionist public intellectual and co-founder of Critical Resistance, writes of racism as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Murder is a killing of another human being that the law deems to be unlawful. But racism, in Gilmore's terms, consigns thousands upon thousands of people to early painful deaths while allowing others to access far in excess of the resources they need. This is mass killing that should be regarded as morally equivalent to murder, but for the fact that the law treats it as permissible. Consider our current moment for just a second. We know that Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people working in food services, in agriculture, and other frontline sectors are dying from COVID at rates well in excess of their numbers in the population, and yet vaccines are overwhelmingly going to white, wealthy seniors in the most affluent parts of the country who are privileged to be retired in their own homes or working from home indefinitely at little or no risk of exposure to the virus. This pattern, the product of a set of intentional, collective, and individual choices on the part of elites, will perpetuate the severe illness and death of poor Black and brown people working in high-risk, low-paid jobs often to meet the needs of those same resource hoarding elites. The term sacrifice zones has been used to describe this phenomenon on an ecological scale. Sacrifice zones are places that are subject to the dumping of environmental toxins or economic disinvestment, such that the land and people in the zone are effectively sacrificed. And again, Black, Indigenous, and poor white people are subjected to premature death, while others enjoy the lifestyle benefits enabled for them by extractive capitalism and by the policing and prison systems that serve to maintain existing distributions of property and life chances and that work to prop up the fossil fuel industry. The pending ecological catastrophe of climate change will exacerbate the racist distribution of life chances. Although the law doesn't regard the deaths that will certainly result as murder, they occur with full knowledge, though, of the causes and consequences. Meanwhile, the vast majority of sexual assaults go unreported and unaddressed. And for that small portion of rapes and killings that result in a prison sentence, it's unclear how justice is being served. No active amends are demanded from those who perpetrate harm. No meaningful accountability or support is offered to survivors. Instead, someone who perpetrated harm is caged for a time or for life, or in rare but significant cases, executed. Abolition recognizes that violence, murderous and rapacious violence, is located in hunger, in war, in homelessness, in extractive capitalism, in gender and sexual hierarchies, in unacknowledged genocide. And abolition questions the categories imposed by criminology, the supposed purposes of policing and prisons, and strives for active amends and accountability. From this perspective, prisons are not a meaningful response to killing and sexual assault, which are rampant and remain largely unredressed. In her book, Are Prisons Obsolete, that we read in connection with the seminar this evening, Angela Davis reminds us that abolitionist praxis is coextensive with Black radical, feminist, and anti-capitalist commitments. The prison industrial complex proliferates spaces, including immigration detention centers, police cages, prison transport vans, where the detritus of capitalism are deposited, she writes. She traces the connections between the prison, exploitative corporate and labor practices, anti-Blackness, militarism, imperialism, and she places at the center of her analysis the urgent need to work in solidarity with incarcerated people to address prison conditions and also to realize social democracy and respond to violence in restorative and reparative terms. Davis's work and the organizing of abolitionists inside and outside prisons have inspired thousands of young people in the movement for Black lives to take to the streets and to offer a radical abolitionist vision for change, including through the Breathe Act proposed this last summer. The proposed Breathe Act would close federal prisons and end federal policing, encourage divestment from state criminal legal systems, and reinvest resources in universal childcare pilot projects, universal basic income pilot projects, Medicare expansion, and equitable public housing. Programs we might understand as a pilot of a fundamentally reorganized social state without prisons and police, and with a different vision of how to care for one another, prevent harm, and respond to violence. The Red Nation, a collective of Indigenous, feminist, abolitionists, and allies, have proposed a Red Deal, building on the Green New Deal, but drawing from Black abolitionist traditions, calling for, and I quote, divestment from the caging, criminalizing, and harming of human beings, and from the exploitative and extractive violence of fossil fuels. The Red Deal envisions a divestment from military spending and occupation, and investment in dignified work to restore the planet, clean air, clean water, free universal education, healthcare, and a broader project of decolonization, anti-capitalism, and for the return of stolen lands or land back. The Red Nation proposes that Indigenous communism is the horizon, queer Indigenous feminism is the way, as you see in the slide reflecting their recent report. Beyond the Breathe Act and the Red Deal, though, abolitionists continue to create an array of radical economic alternatives at the local level. Mutual aid networks explored in a recent book by Dean Spade, worker cooperatives, community land trusts, participatory budgeting campaigns, among other solidarity economy initiatives. And these efforts represent distinct approaches to realizing abolitionist economic alternatives. Some are socialist, Others are communist, still others are anarchist. These visions and projects aim to inspire far-reaching imagination of what's necessary to save our planet and what could be possible in an abolitionist future. But these abolitionist visions and projects stand in stark contrast to the increasing invocation of abolition by academic elites and other prominent voices seeking to harness the excitement surrounding abolition towards other more limited goals. I'd like to turn now to the work of Yale law professor and founding director of Yale's Justice Collaboratory, Tracy Mears, who's taken up abolition, in her words, to recenter policing as a public good. Mears writes, "Policing as we know it must be abolished before it can be transformed." Abolitionist writer and thinker Derica Purnell responded to Mears's first formulation of these ideas in the Boston Review in 2017. Purnell wrote, "Mears's post-abolition transformational call is at best unclear and at worst a liberal version of broken windows policing." Mears more recently has described abolition as connected to a vision of expanded police powers. While invoking the language of abolition, Mears describes all social goods as emanating from the police power. Where do we get public schools, Mears asked rhetorically in a 2020 address. Where do we get clean water? The police power. In legal discourse generally, police powers denote broader state regulatory powers beyond the institution of the police. But in Mears's account, police power often seems to refer centrally to the institution of the police. The Justice Collaboratory, of which Mears is the founding director, is a partner of the US Justice Department's National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, and it works closely with numerous police departments. The collaboratory's promotional materials explain, "We have a specific theory of change. The central goal of the criminal justice system must be to increase cooperation and trust between individuals and the state. We call this procedural justice." The Justice Collaboratory has grown in size and scope over the last 4 years, expanding its work from police to prosecutors, prisons, schools, and international policy. Mears aligns this project with abolitionist Miriam Kaba. According to Mears, Miriam Kaba, a noted proponent of police abolition, whose work I called your attention to earlier, imagines a very large role for the state in the production of safety. Mears writes. Mears cites this New York Times editorial entitled, "Yes, We Mean Literally Abolish the Police," in which Kaba explains abolition in terms of a vision of a different society built on cooperation instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. It's hard for me to understand how the agenda of recentering the police as a public good is compatible with Kaba's call to literally abolish the police. Mears is committed to preserving a central role for police and to police training to promote procedural justice. The sources of this vision, according to Mears, include the perspectives of quote unquote race class subjugated communities who prefer expanded, more procedurally just police powers over other alternatives. But there's little engagement in these projects of the writings and other work of abolitionist organizers, writers, and thinkers from race class subjugated communities. Mears differentiates her abolitionist project from that of abolitionists who favor a privatized, and I quote, "a privatized vision of community control," end quote, over a robust state, but without identifying who these pro-privatization abolitionists are. By contrast, Kaba's account of abolition gestures towards an array of anti-capitalist or social projects, perhaps carried out by a social state, but Kaba also invokes the burgeoning anarcho-feminist indigenous mutual aid movement, suggesting an openness to abolitionist solidarity between socialist, anarchist, communist, and solidarity economy formations. We might also ask, who is placed at the center of this project of recentering policing as a public good, and perhaps recentering prisons as a public good? While suggesting that listening to heavily policed Black and brown people is crucial, the engines of change in this vision and the recipients of resources from foundations are in significant part university research centers and other groups focused on police and prison programming, not those in impacted communities seeking to build solidarity economy projects or create mutual aid networks, not incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people who've always been crucial to abolitionist struggle. I wrote the first article that Bernard proposed that you read for the seminar today, Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice, in the summer of 2014, after Michael Brown was murdered, and as the Ferguson uprising provoked an abolitionist call for racial justice around the country and the world. I'd long identified as an abolitionist. I'd worked with incarcerated people and supported abolitionist campaigns, and I'd long read and admired Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Dylan Rodriguez, among others, whose work profoundly shapes my own thinking. And at the time that I wrote the piece, I was a relatively young, untenured law professor, and I wrote that piece to confront the hypocrisy and narrowness that I perceived in legal discourse, in law schools and in legal scholarship, particularly in criminal law. I wanted to force a confrontation with abolitionist ideas in that place. So returning to this piece now, in a different moment, personally and historically, I now read the article as bizarre and disappointing in its guardedness. It's too cautious. It shies away from what's most powerful and compelling in abolitionist discourse, as do the people whose invocations of abolition I've criticized. And my article attempts to persuade law faculty and law students that they should take abolition more seriously. And without presuming that my arguments had any effect whatsoever, I now have significant ambivalence about this piece, not least because of the ways abolition is being taken up and I believe misappropriated. The second essay posted to the Abolition 1313 site is one I wrote in an effort to offer a more wholehearted account of abolition, one that holds at its center anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and the world-building projects of people committed to abolition inside and outside of prison. So why does any of this matter to prison abolition or more broadly? Abolitionist world-making requires resources and energy. And my hope is that these will flow more to people trying to build abolitionist alternatives inside and outside prisons, to mutual aid networks, to community-based alternative responders, to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, not to police and prison official trainers, to worker cooperatives, to community land trusts, not to university centers associated with the Department of Justice or prison and police agencies. My hope also is that the intellectual attention and the energy of young people and others drawn to abolition, perhaps some in this audience, will focus in this more expansive direction on challenging the foundations of white supremacy, of extractive capitalism, not just encouraging police departments to adopt less racist policies, but on making prisons and police obsolete in favor of other economic and political possibilities. And our work in universities should be to support this redistribution of resources and life chances, to enable a proliferation of abolitionist projects in which we in universities follow rather than lead, and that we recognize abolition as portending the obsolescence, not just of prisons, but also of elitism, of whiteness in our present state. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, thanks Allegra. And thanks for that intervention. That was powerful in a number of ways. I mean, one thing that's particularly powerful there is there's a combination, in a sense, there's a combination of co-optation of abolition on the one hand, the possibilities of co-optation of abolition, but on the other hand, and conjoined with kind of the problem of the thinness of abolition. And those are difficult. The thinness of abolition. So this is not intentional co-optation of a movement that seems to have some energy and some influence today. The thinness, of course, goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And the way in which he himself was talking about abolition democracy as opposed to just abolition. And so in listening to you, I hear that as well. The problem of the thinness of just abolition, of course, is that if you are just interested in thinly abolishing an institution, but not thinking in a larger in a larger way about political economy, and in a way not thinking about precisely the reconstructive project, which was Du Bois's project and which was part of the notion of abolition democracy, then you have all the problems, in part the problems that you're talking about, right? The problems that, well, it's just kind of like, well, let's abolish the police, but rebuild the police. In other words, you abolish an institution, but then it's going to come back. The way in which, slavery was abolished, but then we had convict leasing. So I hear in your intervention here, I see the real parallel also to just a notion of abolition itself. The negative of abolition is too thin, and it needs to be conjoined with a much richer conception of political economy, transformation, and capitalism, transformations, the more radical transformations that you're talking about. So that's really helpful, but also to see that problem conjoined with, at the same time, the problem of real co-optation, which is going on in part, right, as the language becomes more popular and other people are using it, but actually only in an instrumental way. And thanks also for the self-reflection about your pieces, and I understand completely. It is true that in that first 2015 piece, there is a way in which you were trying to make it palatable to a legal audience in a way, but of course that what I would say to you, kind of to assuage you in your critique, is that that was a different period in history almost, and therefore the interventions that one would make in a period when abolition is not even really in discourse the way it is now, would be and are different than the interventions that you're going to make right now. In other words, there isn't a universality to critical theory in this sense. These are timely interventions, punctual interventions. You are making a very important punctual intervention that now you shouldn't look back on it and say, in a way, oh, it's too palatable. It fits too much in kind of a reform mentality or something, because actually it was a different moment in 2014, 2015, when you were publishing that, and it played in a different way and it had different effects. But I think that's something about critical theory and the situatedness of interventions in critical theory. So let's see, Dwayne. So I think Dwayne, you should have an opportunity, and then I want to bring in. We've got just a great roundtable. I see Shayla Ben-Habib has her hand raised, so I'm going to try and bring in the roundtable as soon as possible. As you start, Dwayne.
Yeah, I'll just jump in.
Yeah,
Man, I'm just not really a part of this academic space where we talk about abolition and we don't talk about, my man called me the other day. He said, yeah, the prosecutor called me, federal prosecutor called me, say, the dude who murdered my cousin has applied for release because of COVID. And they want my position on it. Like, I mean, I think a lot of these conversations just don't exist in the world that I live in. I think these conversations don't account for violence in a way that I understand it to exist in my community. I think they don't account for how we need to respond to violence. We could dismiss the state, but the state is a proxy for what we would do, and not full-throatedly saying what we would do in response to that, I just think is disingenuous. When I wrote the piece about Harris, somebody had the temerity to write me and tell me that they were disappointed in what I said, as if I give a fuck about their disappointment. I'm not even supposed to curse on this show because I'm supposed to pretend like these issues don't make your blood get heated. I'm supposed to pretend like when we talk about abolition and getting people out of prison, that we're supposed to do it in such a way that doesn't say, it was a hearing a couple weeks ago. This cat in Connecticut that I know spent more than 2 decades in prison. He murdered his cousin. And so he was getting a sentence rehearing because of this policy that's in Connecticut that allows it to happen. This wasn't like strangers in a community saying that he should stay in prison forever. This is his blood saying that he should stay in prison forever. And a conversation about abolition that doesn't account for those things is not a conversation about abolition that I'm fully interested in having. Because I just think it's fake. I think it's not real. I think it's skirting all of the issues that matter. And this is why, like 20 minutes ago, Slate published an article about why Poetry Foundation and Poetry Magazine published somebody that was convicted of sex offenses and how that enraged this small, elite, cloistered poetry community. Like, I just don't even want to participate in a conversation about abolition that doesn't forthrightly allow me to acknowledge what friends of mine say when they confront the people that murdered their family members. It is a real anger and rage and outrage at violence, at even car theft. Like, fuck murder, fuck rape, fuck child assault, fuck, like, forget all of that stuff. We lock people up in increasing numbers because they steal cars, and there is no account for what we should do that's different from that. And you know, I'm supposed to pretend like I have some like articulate thing to say to that, but I am frankly tired of pretending that, because it hasn't been people in the street that have denied me my dignity, denied me the opportunity to work. It has been our colleagues. It has been like Harvard Law School that says, what will your classmates think about what you know about criminal law? And what they really meant to say is, what will your classmates think about the gun that you held to somebody's head? It has been the Connecticut bar examiners that said, I don't think you had a character of fitness. So it ain't even the people that's in my neighborhood that's denying me my dignity and my right to opportunity and access. It's like the elites. It's all of us. And I think this is a pretend conversation, because when they deny me something, they're saying what really matters to us is who you harmed and if you harm us. And a conversation and discussion about abolition, you know what? I'm just speaking for my mom. It doesn't satisfy my mom. Like, nothing that I just heard satisfies my mom, doesn't satisfy my homies, doesn't satisfy the people I know that got murdered, doesn't even satisfy the dudes I know in prison for killing people. And I think a conversation doesn't even try to meet them where they live and they suffer. It's a false one. It is a completely false one.
Ivan, Allegra, you wanted to jump in, and then Ivan, and then we're going to start the roundtable kind of conversation here. And Ivan, I saw Jindu, and I know Shayla wanted in. So, but Allegra, did you want to say something first before Ivan jumps in?
I think the murder of one person by another person, sexual assault, rape, they matter tremendously, and they tear lives apart. But I think we make a fetish of certain sorts of violence, and that we have to also think about violence in a broader perspective. And the forms of violence that create landscapes in which, for example, certain gun-related homicides become a prevalent aspect of daily life. And I think that's some of what Dwayne is calling our attention to. And I think that those forms of suffering are significant, but I think that we have to think about violence in a broader perspective. And I don't think that incarcerating someone does much, if anything, to offer redress in the aftermath of murder or sexual assault, notwithstanding how profound the need for justice and restoration and repair is in those circumstances.
Thanks, Allegra. Let's do this, because we've got a lot of great minds and people who might have something interesting. I know I want to jump in too, but let's have a round on this roundtable. Let's have a round of quick reactions, and then back to you, Dwayne. Okay, Ivan, if you want. Sorry, I mean, you know, I thought hands were up. You know what I mean? Like, if you feel like I saw you, you know.
I'm really quick. Hello, everybody. I'm Ivan. Even though it says Carlos on my screen, that's my first name. My middle name is Ivan. Everyone calls me Ivan. I just want to say thank you to Reginald. Thank you to Allegra. I've been home now going on 3 years. I just finished doing 20 years in prison. And I've spent 85% of my life in some type of institution or another. I've been through this, whether it's foster care system, the juvie, Rikers Island, and then ultimately state prison. So I was pretty much raised in these structures that we're talking about. And I've never, since I've been home, been in a conversation like this. And I'm loving every second of it. Like real talk. Some of the stuff is hard to talk about, and some of the stuff doesn't get talked about. And so I think some of the, I think the quote that you, Bernard, that you quoted, Reginald, about sort of not recirculating this carceral logic, right? And I think that's what a lot of these reform, when people talk about reforms, you know, and I say this all the time, is reform to me means taking money away from the communities that need the money, taking the money that we need. I live in the South Bronx, and instead of giving that money to the communities, we give it to the police so they can get nicer suits, or they can get this 8-week training on cultural sensitivity. And it doesn't make any sense to me because it doesn't work. So when we talk about reform, it's recirculating this carceral logic. So we need to get rid of this carceral logic, not reform, get rid of this carceral logic and look for a better way, a different way. And I just love this conversation. This is tough, man. And I think Reginald's coming with the heat. And I'm just curious to see how folks are gonna respond, man. Thank you. And I'm gonna drop the mic. Bam.
Bam. All right, Jindu, jump in.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all so much. This has been incredible. I've just been taking notes since. And Reginald, when you said the comment about like how this is a fake conversation if we don't talk about violence, that resonated so deeply because I feel like the way in which we enter these conversations as folks that are rooted in like the Black radical tradition, the queer tradition, the indigenous tradition, like Allegra cited, are entering this conversation from a point of centering violence, right? When we think about the PIC, when we think about the ways in which racial capitalism operates, we're thinking about the state having a monopoly on like when it's appropriate to cause harm, right? And the state being able to respond to when we're violated, when interpersonally something happens, to use sort of like your emotion in that moment, the emotion of the person that's harmed, to enter or introduce state violence to crush the person who caused harm, right? And when I think about the ways in which violence often circles my mind as I think about abolition, I think about the ways in which we've all been so privileged to like learn from Miriam Kaba, but she has this sentiment that she circulates. And the most recent way I can think about when she said it was in an interview with Chris Hayes. And it was essentially, you know, abolition is not about our interpersonal reaction. It's not about the reaction of someone who's harmed when, you know, violence occurs, when harm occurs. And although those feelings are valid and those reactions are valid, what's not valid is our reliance, our dependence on the state to come in and destroy the human being that essentially destroyed us and calling that just. And I also think about, there was a really striking line in your New York Times article, and it was like a small line. You talked about your mom who had, experienced grave harm. And towards the end of the essay, you say a prosecutor's subpoena forced her to testify. I thought, like, I sat with that for such a long time. What does it mean for a system that calls itself just, a criminal legal system, to force a survivor that they're, ostensibly supposed to be helping, to force them into a process that's so adversarial, that's so violent, to the point where people are calling, the engagement of survivors in the criminal legal system and trigger and content warning, but they call it second rate, right? Like when someone goes through the system after they've been harmed in that way, the ways in which they're meant to prove their humanity, the ways in which they're meant to prove their character, the ways in which they're meant to prove what happened to them actually happened, are so dehumanizing and violent, frankly, for a system that yields so few results, right? We think about the fact that only 5.7% of sexual offenses result in an arrest, let alone conviction. That's 0.7%, right? And what survivors have to go through before they even get to that tiny 0.7%. And I think about the ways in which when we talk about the prison or the criminal legal system, the PIC as a way to respond to violence and harm, we're not really, I think we're doing that in a way that kind of deprives us of, or rather shifts away the responsibility that we all have to create safe conditions, to create sort of those interpersonal relationships, community relationships, accountable processes to make each other feel safe, to hold one another. Because if you harm me, and I know the shorthand is me calling 911 and they just like haul you off, like my neighbors don't have a responsibility to me. The system has no further responsibility to me to make me whole, to give me any sort of redress, financially, what have you, right? I think about me as someone who survived harm, and I think about like when the state entered that harm and how that trauma was compounded like 5-6 times, right? And then previously, right? And it was harm that involved a weapon, right? And I think about the ways in which I was crushed to make room for them to crush someone else. So I'm always thinking about violence, and I'm so grateful that you introduced that into this conversation. And I'm so excited to like be in constant conversation about this. So after we all circle around, I know I hope to have some more comments.
Great. I know it's tough I know Dwayne and Allegra, you must have a lot you already want to say, but should we get in the round and then give you more time? Because I think that would be good, because this is so rich. And I know Derica Purnell is also on, and I'm hoping that she's going to be able to join us as well. Shayla, did you want to jump in?
Oh my gosh, am I?
You were next, but you know what? I can come back to you because I've got Jocelyn and Alexis also. Would you?
Have I unmuted myself?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. No, it's better to say something right now because I'm not sure I'm going to be wiser somewhat later. I mean, this is an unusual domain for me. I'm usually farther up in the clouds, but I just want to say I was very moved by a couple of points that Reginald made. And to me, they gather around this question of where is the state, where is the public authority when something happens or when I do something. I mean, Reginald was saying that we have to recognize at a very existential level both the fear and the harm and the hurt that moments of violence cause. They tear the social fabric. And it is maybe, the kind of statist, sovereigntist ideology that we have since the 17th, 18th century, that it's not the community, but it is this other power. And if I'm not misunderstanding him, what he's saying is that, look, there is a moment there that we have to focus upon. I was very touched when at the beginning of his presentation, he said, nobody asked me what I did as a young man, why did I become a felon? What was that moment of violence that just like that moment when sort of there was a rupture in the social fabric? I know this can be used and misused by the right, by people who focus on violence and as if that was just the act to talk about. But I also am hearing him, and I'm hearing him saying something to us, maybe academics who are attempting to totalize this, into saying just dwell with that moment and think about what can be a response. I mean, theoretically, I of course at many dimensions I agree with Allegra. I do, but there are, how shall I put it? I'm a critical theorist in the Frankfurt School tradition. I believe in the social totality, that every short step must lead to a more comprehensive explanation. But I want to say to Allegra, there are fractures and there are tears and there are contradictions. The call to abolish the police is not hurting you and me. It's hurting the communities that are vulnerable in the inner cities. In terms of a vision of the community of the future that we want to move into, I'm completely with you. But one has to move carefully. You cannot achieve social utopia. Somehow you have to mediate between reform and utopia. There have to be steps. So I heard Reginald saying, one step at a time, talk concretely about what's happening, slowly move, and so those are some reflections. This is a very touching and moving conversation. So I've got to think more myself about these issues.
Thanks, Shayla, and that is really helpful in a way in actually offering a way to in part. Well, I mean, I'll let Dwayne respond, but in part think about that kind of stepwise way that you were thinking about it. Alexis and Jocelyn, and then we'll go back.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be a part of this conversation, to listen to this conversation. I am as much of a student of abolition as I am a teacher. I know Bernard and I teach this class on abolition now for the second year. But I came to abolition slowly and from sort of a very narrow area of practice. And for me, it was spending time just over a decade representing men who had been condemned to die. So those that our legal system had cast aside, our society has cast aside as the worst of the worst. And my role was really to humanize my clients in an effort to take death off the table. And for many of my clients, that meant still life in prison, often without parole. And that was seen as a victory. But through the social history investigations that we put together during this appeals process, I learned that no one commits violence and harm, which is what we have been talking about throughout tonight, is harm. No one commits that in a vacuum. And so without exception, all of my clients were people who had experienced pervasive trauma throughout their developmental years. And it was often at the hands of those who they were meant to trust, those most proximate to them, family members, parents, guardians. And then those people had themselves experienced often intergenerational trauma. And so abolition has to consider, and does consider, there is room for this. How is it that we address harm? How is it that we prevent harm from repeating in the future, in these subsequent generations? And I've most recently been thinking about sort of a public health model where we focus on, preventative measures. And in some ways, our society has to create an environment in which we eradicate adverse childhood experiences. I think about how much that would do to stem sort of violence and the perpetuation of harm, not just within families, but more broadly. And so I really see abolition as this lens through which we can understand, break free from systems of oppression. I see it as a model for liberation, for creativity. With our students, we use the term, reimagine, radical transformation, because the system that we have in place, as we all know, isn't sustainable. And so I think about these issues from my, in representing individuals and in the approach that I have at times with victims, family members, and their survivors about potentially some pathway to restorative justice. This is not easy. There's no one way, there's no one quick solution, but I think abolition does give us room to be creative, to be dynamic, to be nimble, but really to cut off the perpetuation of harm. And I really appreciate all of the sort of pushing and challenging that we're all engaged in, because I think it makes, our ideas, it's encouraging to be challenged. But yeah, I just really appreciate this conversation, and thank you, Bernard, for inviting me to be a part of it.
Thank you, Alexis. Jocelyn, you want to jump in?
Sure, yes. Yeah, I'll start by saying thank you as well to everyone who's gone so far. I guess I'll start just sort of thanking all of you, but concentrating on Allegra. I also sort of, as Bernard said, really appreciated sort of looking back on a piece that you've written in this new time, saying we need to be bolder. And I don't think of you as, maybe it's a different, I don't think of you as utopian, but I heard you sort of grounding us in what movements are trying to do on the ground, which might be small acts of solidarity or mutual aid, but that over time add up to sort of visions of utopia, not that you're generating, but that you're sort of in solidarity with. And I appreciate that new grounding. Listening to all of you, and especially your call for us in the academy to think about our complicity in the making of the carceral state, are also just, I'm a law professor. And so hearing you talk today, I came from just an hour or so ago, I was teaching evidence to Columbia law students. And today we were learning about prior bad acts evidence. And I can't get this out of my head, so it really is, my main reaction to this is some wise things I heard my students say when we were talking about prior bad acts. I brought to them a case that's hard to talk about. It's the worst murder of the last year in our public consciousness in some ways, which is Derek Chauvin, the police officer who killed George Floyd in Minneapolis. And he's on trial right now. And I'm teaching evidence class. So the thing we have to talk about are these little rules of evidence at play in his case. And it turns out that the prosecutors were trying to put in 8 different times where the same officer used kinds of force. And I don't want to get too detailed because I know it's hard to talk about, but essentially it used the same kinds of lethal force against Black bodies in ways that didn't end up in death, but ended up in harm. And the prosecutor wanted to put these into evidence. And for the most part, we're not allowed to put these into evidence because they're prior bad acts. And some of them were let in, and we had a conversation about the rule. But my students wanted to push back on the fact that I was even teaching them this rule of evidence in this class we call evidence, in this school we call law school. I had one student say, aren't those really prior bad acts of the police department and the city, because they let him stay on the police force. And then someone else said, I feel like if we don't let in prior bad acts, then we don't let in our histories. And here we have the history of the police department. And those things stuck with me in part because I think as a law professor, I sometimes, at least in my teaching, get caught up in applying these legal rules. I think that the rule has actually been misapplied in Derek Chauvin's criminal trial, and forget how much the law and our legal rules and our structures and the ways we're forced to think about things focus us in on individuals and their prior bad acts, rather than systemically, what has our history been? Systemically, where is the violence coming from? And I don't have any answers, but I was moved by that discussion with my students today, in part taking this person who for so many, I didn't poll the class, but for so many would be an obvious candidate for prison. And yet even that in our discussion, as much as people were distraught by just, you see this trail of vicious violence, and how did we let that happen was sort of the feeling that I didn't know was going to come from them. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to more of this discussion.
Thanks, Jocelyn. All right, let's do this, huh? Dwayne, why don't you go next, then Allegra. I want to go. Ivan's got your hand up, so how about Dwayne, Allegra, Ivan, and then me, okay? And then we'll do another round. How's that? Okay. But yeah, Dwayne, why don't you jump in and then.
Yeah, I appreciate being here, and I appreciate everybody's comments. It's interesting because I might pronounce your name wrong. I'm sorry, Jindu, but my mom also said that when I asked her what she thinks should have happened, she said that she wanted to take the pistol from the marshal and shoot dude in his head. He raped 3 women over a span of months and maybe raped more. Like, I'm not just going to sit here and act like harm and violence is not, and it's not singular, and it's not like individual cases. Most people locked up are locked up for violent crimes. We're not going to excuse me putting a pistol to somebody's head by acting like I am some kind of like anomaly. That's not how we account for this, and that's not how we address this. I just feel like that's false, and I'm not going to address it by arguing that we need to expand our definition of violence. I think in some like real fundamental way, people just afraid of saying what they think should happen. We want to get rid of the police, but what we think that we're just going to let people, like, we have to account for how we want to address violence. And it's I've listened to some of these folks. Article just came out today. Larry Krasner, 50% of the cases he's requesting more than like $900,000 in bail. We're not going to pretend like it's like Wretched of the Earth when Franz Fan. And first of all, I sound different from everybody up here. And I
No,
curse on purpose. And I curse on purpose because in prison, people curse. In my community, people curse. I got a Yale law degree, and all of the language folks use in conversations like this is meant to distance me from the community that I am a part of. And it is not like the people under the stairs. It is the Georgetowns and the Columbias and the Yales and the University of Maryland's and the Prince George's community colleges and the Howard universities that stigmatize folks with a criminal record. And so we want to have this broad conversation about abolition as if in our daily practice we believe it. And I want you to allow me to say this. Cat, I said something on Facebook. I said I want this rapist to live in a corner cell forever. And I was like, this rapist, just this one person. And the person said, I'm really disappointed in you. Who the fuck is you to be disappointed in me? I talked about one person. A real account of abolition allows me to express true anger and allows you to try to convince me that I am wrong. But it does not mean that we're all going to sit here and lie and act like we have like a deeply felt need to believe that somebody in a cell made them safer. My homeboys murdered people. That is it. That is it. It's no tagline to that shit. It's no like they did it because how they were harmed. They did it because they were poor. No, they murdered people. And if we're going to have this conversation about freedom and about abolition, and every time we say the word violence, it's a way to brush it under the table, then this is just not a legitimate conversation. And I did not grow up reading none of the abolitionists. I grew up in fucking prison. And I am not going to be like judged because my rhetoric is not based on studying this shit for a decade. My rhetoric is based on living in prison with men who died in prison. That is where I'm coming from. And it is this like willingness to try to I remember when I was writing the Harris piece, they was like, it came out and they was like, Dwayne, you really should read Allegra McLeod. I fucking read Allegra piece in 2018 when it first came out. And I did not think it was mealy mouth. It gave me ambition to try to understand what I wanted to make possible. I did not think it was like weak spirited and like applesauce or whatever the fuck like Scalia would say about it. I thought that it was a full throated defense of what it meant to try to get people out of prison, and it was the first one that I had read and I connected to. I don't think you need to walk that back. But that's your decision about how you want to walk the piece back. But when I read it, it inspired me. And I haven't been inspired with a lot of the things other people say. And I just think like somebody said, Dwayne, you went to Yale Law School and you need to stop pretending like you didn't. And I was mad at first because I was like, bruh, I was at Sussex One State Prison. 2 weeks ago, a guard got stabbed there. And he was like, yeah, you were there. But you went to Yale Law School and you keep having these conversations with 2% of the population, pretending like it is the thing that is happening in the households of everybody in this country. And they were like, look, it's cool. You believe whatever you want. but you decide when you want to have a conversation about the shit that we talking about at our dinner table. And I don't think we having that conversation right now. And I hate to bring up this like really small cloistered poetic community, but I'm telling you, an article in the Slate, an article in the Guardian, because people within the poetic community are mad because this cat served time in prison for child porn and they published his poem. This is why they're mad. The distance between where we are right now and the world we imagining is so far that we're afraid to even acknowledge it. We just like, it's just like, I am baffled. And I wish I would go to the parole board and say any of the things I hear people say on Twitter. Everybody I know would die in prison if I did say any of those things. And my homies would be like, dude, you you know I killed somebody with their son in the next room? That's the shit I'm dealing with. Like that's what I'm trying to get over. And that is not, ain't nobody making no excuses. It's just weird. It's I find it fundamentally distressing the degree to which we have this conversation and refuse to try to answer any hard questions and insult people who raise hard questions. Two white men yesterday said they were disappointed in me. I'm so mad I didn't say, nigga, I'm disappointed in slavery. Like, what do you mean you disappointed in me because I said that somebody raped somebody I care about and I am angry? They said they are disappointed in me publicly saying that I am angry at a violent crime that has occurred to somebody in my family. When I literally represent people who have killed people, I deal with the questions on an everyday basis. I just think, and I'm rambling and I apologize, I'm never going to get invited to this thing again. But
No, what are you talking about? What are you talking
I
about?
just I just think it's like a fundamental. I talked to Bernard about this. People are, it's a fundamental failure to one, disagree in public, and two, I just don't know, man. I would say one more
Look,
thing.
look, Dwayne, I spent 10 years at the University of Chicago. Let me tell you, like, we like disagreement. Okay. So we
All right, cool.
okay. So, I mean, no, you don't need to apologize. I got something to say. I mean, but putting the issues on the table and really dealing with them is what this is all about. Okay. So you don't need to apologize, and you're
You remember?
invited to every single freaking panel for Abolition Democracy 1313. And so I hope you will be at all
All
of them.
right.
All right.
You remember that panel? This is the last thing I'll say. You remember the panel you were on at Yale about abolition?
Yeah.
It was a woman on the panel whose child was in prison. And you know what hurt me so much is listening to her talk. I was like, this is abolition. She was like, I'm trying to get people out of prison. I'm trying to get them to stop blocking letters. I'm trying to get parole packets in the prison. And yo, those elite law students looked at her with such disdain. They ain't even ask her a question. Her kid was doing life, and she had spent like 10, 15 years trying to get him out. And these elite law students who was going to work at PDS and all these elite places across the country looked at her with such utter disdain. And it was like, and it just captured it for me. The abolition that people on the ground whose sons are doing life in prison are working for, sometimes it's just utterly different from what happens in these conversations.
Mm,
I mean, they looked at her with such,
mm,
it was sad. It was like, and I know it was sad because if it was recorded, you would hear me yelling at the students and being intentionally combative because of the way they ignored her and like disrespected her presence.
mm, mm. But I think I'll come to this. I want to let Allegra and Ivan talk first, but I think it has something. I think something really important here has to do with kind of telling telling other people what to do versus working on yourself. And so I'll come back to that. But and I think that's a huge difference here that we need to develop. But Allegra, I want to hear from you first. Ivan, then I'll jump in. Then Jindu, go ahead. Give everybody a chance. Sorry. Usually I monopolize. You're on mute. Usually I talk too much, but I'm trying to be, okay.
Thanks, Bernard. And I thought I heard you mention that Derica Purnell was on the call and wanted to join the conversation. And
yeah, I'm working on that. I'm not sure if we're
okay. I just wanted to make sure that when you suggested that you wanted to go around that I wasn't
Yeah,
jump
you're trying to add her. Yeah.
So, you know, Dwayne, I really appreciate your expression of frustration and anger. And I think in many ways I share that rage. And in addressing the question, what about the murders and the rapists, in the way that I've done, I don't mean to indicate that grappling in a deep, serious, and urgent way with the question of what to do in the aftermath of interpersonal harm is not of the utmost significance. But I think I come to the question from a different perspective, perhaps. So I myself am a survivor of sexual and physical violence. And as an adolescent, I was a participant for a time in a criminal prosecution related to those events. And I opted out fairly shortly after the proceedings began because I found the process to be re-victimizing, to be profoundly homophobic, and devastating, really, as a survivor of violence. And so I think that Jindu's suggestion that for at least some survivors, the criminal process does not offer redress or repair is also significant in thinking about the question of abolition. And if we think about the kind of broader landscape of the particular sort of murder and sexual assault that you've called our attention to, I think there's a very substantial set of reasons for doubt as to how well the criminal legal system adequately addresses these problems. So of some 20 homicides on the south and west sides of Chicago, only 1 of every 20 results in a criminal conviction and prison sentence. 19 of every 20 people who are murdered, their families get no vindication, if that were even possible, through the criminal legal process. And I think it's important to remember that, and Jindu's already called to our attention the extent to which sexual assault is followed by impunity. So then that poses the question, what to do instead? And I think that's an urgent and important question. And I didn't mean to suggest that it's not, but instead I think we can't only focus on these forms of violence. We have to think about violence in a broader framework as well, and think about what would offer restoration and repair, not only in the aftermath of these particular incidents, but in terms of the factors that lead to cycles of violence, and in terms of the violence that the prison itself perpetrates. And I think one powerful passage in Angela Davis's text that we read for today, Our Prisons Obsolete, is where she talks about the prison as a sexual assailant and all the ways in which the routine procedures of prison body cavity searches and the like perpetrate sexual assault every day, every hour, and so on. And I wanted to just share with the audience a piece that's co-authored by Craig Muhammad, a man serving life sentence in prison in Maryland presently, and a brilliant young lawyer and writer, a journalist, and a former Georgetown law student named Noah Gimbel. And their piece is called Are Police Obsolete? And I'll post it to the chat now. And what that piece does is it really begins in a maximum security prison in Maryland, and it tries to think about the problem of murder, of homicide, and how to address it. And from the perspective of people who are incarcerated, who have formed organizations like Project Emancipation Now and Friend of a Friend, and are helping violence-involved people try to find ways of living and engaging with one another that don't involve violence, particularly Ben that will be soon leaving the Maryland prison system. And they work on the outside in worker cooperatives of some of the sort that I described in my remarks, also in reclaiming condemned housing that will otherwise be destroyed, and turning these into community spaces where they engage in restorative conferences. They do violence mediation and violence prevention work, political education, and these aren't perfect answers to the problems that their communities face, but I think they're a serious attempt to think about how to prevent violence, how to respond to violence, that do better than putting people in cages. And so those are some of my thoughts, but there's so much more to say, but a few kind of comments in response to the provocations of everyone in the go around. I had another response to Shayla Ben Habib's provocation, but I think I'll hold that for now, perhaps the next time around.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Ivan, okay, Jindu, then I'll say something quickly, and then we're going to open it up also to a lot of the other folks who are online as well.
Oh, Bernard, I'll pass for now. I want to hear from you. I'm having a great time. I'm learning so much right now, like real shit. I'll pass to you, please.
I want to hear from you, Ivan, man.
Now, you already heard enough from me. I want to hear from you, please. If I got something to say, I'll chime in later. But right now, I don't have any value to add. Okay. So go, please.
You want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, no, sure, absolutely. And I hope y'all don't mind if I jotted down a couple of notes when other folks were speaking. And the first one I thought of was I think Selah, when you talked about the call to abolish the police is not hurting you, it's hurting the communities in the inner cities. And I thought what was dangerous about that statement was the potential and the actualization of erasing Black, brown, and poor people, Black femmes in particular, poor Black femmes in particular, from a context that they created. Abolition didn't originate here. The call for abolition and to abolish the violence of the carceral state did not, originate at this level. It originated in communities and at the street, at the street level. And so I think that we have to be really, really careful in not erasing people from things that they created and that they, proliferated. And I also think, that also erases the ways in which when we come in contact with people, and I'm saying we as a Black person, a Black woman, come in contact with police and the carceral state, right? That comes with the grave risk of our harm, our assault, our death, right, our criminalization. And so when we talk about not needing the police, I can say that from being someone who's at Columbia now, but when, and coming up and being someone who came over from Nigeria and came up the way I did and moving through the world, I'm still a Black person, I'm still a Black woman. And my contact with the police comes with fear, right? And I think about, there's this really incredible resource called Expanding Our Scope, Expanding Our Frame, Deepening Our Demands for Safety and Healing for Black Women, or Black Survivors of Sexual Violence, and it's by Andrea Ritchie, and I can drop a link in the chat. And she talks about how for every one Black femme that comes to say that they've survived an assault that relies on the system to, respond to their assault, 15 do not, right? And those 15 do not because of, fear of criminalization, fear of assault, fear of harm. And what does it mean for us not to really hold that as a truth, right? Something happens to me, the last thing I'm going to do is call the police. I will do it if I have no other, alternative. And then when they do enter the situation, they always invariably make it worse. And I can cite 2 times. So I want to just ground that and make sure that we're not erasing people. We're not intellectualizing this thing that's not ours to intellectualize and, kind of hold in our ivory settings. And then something else that I was really interested in was this notion of transforming the current carceral system, because I feel and Professor Harcourt, you said this earlier, it's what did you say? A thin concept of abolition as a removal, but to me, it seems like a flattening of abolition democracy, right? People don't want to go through the harm and the trauma and the work, frankly, of finding out what life without the carceral state is going to look like, right? Because it involves us really, doing the hard work of answering the questions Reginald has posed, what do we do with the neighbor down the street that we don't like? What do we do with that person over there who causes harm every other time that you see them, right? It involves us really getting into this messy, what I think of as productive generative discourse of we are going to be in a state of chaos for a while once we get rid of these systems, and folks don't want to live there. They want to skip that and go straight to okay, well, what does a new version of policing look like? And that's so dangerous because it flattens the need to stop the bleeding, right? We have to stop the harm initially. And I really was so interested in this idea of what you said, Reginald, about like folks murder people, right? And like, I was interested in the flattening of that because, you know, I can only speak for myself. Like my abolitionist politic has come in from me building community and solidarity with people who are both currently and formerly incarcerated. And so much of abolitionist thought and brilliance comes from people who are currently and formerly incarcerated. So I want to make sure that we're not kind of flattening people, because the whole thing is, and Brian Stevenson says this, and I know that you probably have thoughts of me citing him, but you know, we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done, right? And you know, someone who kills someone, okay, they've killed someone, but they also paint or write or have the capacity to turn their life around, have the capacity to be generative, have like are still part of our community. And what does it mean that our conception of safety is so thin and so fragile that it's premised on this idea of like, I don't care where you are, but as long as you're somewhere else and that somewhere else is far away from me, I feel safe and I can cling to that sort of like imagination of my safety. And I really love what Allegra, you said about, you know, us kind of like throwing people into a system that's a site of sexual harm, but not only a site of sexual harm, physical harm, spiritual harm, right? And what does it mean that when we throw people away, we assume that they stop that harm, right? Like when we throw Derek Chauvin away, and I think, Jocelyn, you said like he's the prototypical person, the obvious candidate for prison, like part of my, you know, identity that's still getting there, it was like, yes, I need the prison to destroy him. And then the other part was like, okay, well, someone is always going to have that ideal candidate. And next time that ideal candidate is going to be, God forbid, like my brother or like, you know, my cousin or someone I had deep community with. Everyone's always going to have that. Well, this is the kind of person who should always be incarcerated. And what does it mean that that person is always going to be connected to someone who has deep relational care to them or with them? And so like, that's, you know, kind of some of what I was thinking. There was a last thing, but I can't remember it. If I remember it, hopefully I can unmute. But yeah, thank y'all.
Joe, yeah, okay, so in a second, I'm going to ask all the students also to turn on their videos and ask questions and participate as well. But I can't not jump in here. So one thing that I really disagree with is the way in which Dwayne, you're kind of trying to create a divide between theory and practice here. I think is in the way in which you're kind of like trying to suggest that, you know, this is an academic debate or something, or that like this is too theoretical or something. I mean, I think what you're saying is deep, and your artwork and everything you do is deeply critical theory. Now, maybe it's obviously not, you know, put under that umbrella, but it is deeply theorized in the way in which precisely other people are trying to figure this out in that way. And that opposition, I think, is really important because in effect, ultimately, what I really feel here is that it all turns back to actually what each of us are actually doing. As I listen to you and I think about, you know, what you are doing in terms of trying to represent folks, your friends, being in conversation, the artwork you're making. Now, I don't want to talk about you, but just like, or you know, in that sense, it's what ultimately what this is about, I think, is what am I doing? What more should I be doing in terms of representation, in terms of working with my friends on death row or serving life, etc. Right now, and that becomes a very personal intervention. I think you specifically spoke about the way in which you are trying to get folks, your friends, right, out, right, and I don't think that it's necessarily the case that any of us should be talking about what other people should be doing. I think that, in a sense, that is ultimately the problem, the glitch. And I almost sense that might be one of the glitches that, or one of the problems that you're identifying or feeling, maybe. But obviously, I'm not going to, you know, just, it's not going to, you know, suggest anything like that, but it's about a lot of the appropriate resistance that I hear in your in what you were saying is a resistance to, you know, the ACLU telling us what to do when in fact, you know, they weren't doing the right thing, right? Or the Poetry Journal, like, not doing the right thing, and the complicity, or Yale or Columbia Law School, or the fact that we've got a terrible box on our applications about you know, prior arrests and convictions. And so those issues of hypocrisy and complicity, I feel, don't in any way stop me, or aren't going to stop me from doing what I can to intervene on behalf of my friends to try and get them out, which means that there's some difference here. There's some friction here between telling other people what to do, or even having a position on abolition as a general matter, and what one does, right? And I kind of feel as if that's all I care about, is what one does, both in turn, and it's not a doing that is simply about doing and not theory. Actually, it turns out what one does is a confrontation with the theoretical work that you're doing in your poetry and in your artwork.
Yeah, I remember. I remember I say two things. One, to Jindu, I didn't mean to suggest that people whatever crimes they committed. I meant to say I grew up in prison. I went to prison when I was 16. I didn't go to a prom. I didn't go to a high school dance. I grew up with men doing 30, 40, 50 years in prison. You know, I like when I decided to pursue law, it was in a cell. It was studying a paralegal course to make the days go by. I love men I did my time with. I've been to more prisons than I could count. And in nearly every one of those prisons, they say nobody's ever come back. Nobody's ever even been here. No writers, no scholars, no thinkers. So I wasn't suggesting that people are just the crime they committed. I was suggesting, and I remember I got an argument at at Greaterfoot, because I said, no, my project is not to humanize people in prison. My fucking project is to make people outside of prison understand that it is a crime the way they dehumanize people in prison. How am I make a human human? Not humanizing anybody. What I was trying to say though is that in really confronting the lives we lived, I have to confront the total sum of the lives that we've lived. And what I was trying to say, and then I'll just end here because I got to jump off in 6 minutes. But what I was trying to say is maybe the doing that I'm trying to do is create a world in which justice is not me not admitting that I carjacked somebody. Justice is finding a space that allows for a crime to have occurred and folks to move forward. And I think what you said was like fundamentally the point of all of it. It's going to be chaos. And don't nobody want chaos. And nobody even admits that. Nobody admits that, like, I said this on a Twitter thread when I was talking about the poetry issue. You don't believe in abolition and mercy because you have some fucking crystal ball that says people going to be safe when you let people free. You believe in abolition and mercy because that's your ethic. That's how you think the world should operate. And so many of us, I think, have a conversation about mercy and abolition and decreasing the prison population that is premised on the idea that I'm not going to put a pistol to your head. And frankly, you just don't know. And that's why the parole board doesn't let people free, because their decision is predicated on what society demands, and what society demands is safety. And if we have a conversation about abolition that doesn't push back against that notion, then I think we're missing something. And what I recognize, I appreciate what you said, Bernard, but what I recognize every time I had these conversations is my friends in the space dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And I don't give a fuck, Because what I know is anybody who served time with me knows that when they send me a letter, the stack of letters I got right here, that I respond and I show up and I find somebody to help them get out of prison. So I'm not even concerned with people telling me that like I'm some wishy-washy progressive or I'm a libertarian on a low or like I'm actually invested in the carceral state. Every criticism that Allegra charged at Tracy Mears and Philip Goff, somebody could charge at me. And frankly, I don't care because I know what I do in the space and I am proud of what I do in the space. And in fact, I'm proud of what they do in the space.
Mm-hmm. And okay, Ivan, Arabella, just one second, but that is about what you do, right? That is about what you do, what you're doing, right? That was, I mean, that's where I mean, I agree entirely with you in terms of that is, I mean, I don't care whether we call it abolitionist or not. That is admirable, all that you do. And I think that is what we need to focus on. It is admirable what you do. And we need to think about what is it that we are doing, right? So Ivan.
Yeah, wow. I'm sort of blown away. But I just want to say that we sort of been working on presumption, and I'm just going to go keep the focus on myself. That we sort of been working on the presumption that violence is bad, and the reason I say that is because I grew up. I was taken away from my biological parents when I was 2 years old, and I was thrown into foster care system. And one of the very first lessons, most valuable lessons that I learned while I was in the foster care system is that if I was willing and able to be as violent as possible, I could stop myself from being a victim. I could stop I could stop myself from being raped. Like I saw some of the kids getting raped and abused, physically abused by some of the staff. And I learned very early that if I was willing to be as violent, if not more violent than the most violent person there, I could survive. And that sort of informed and colored the way I interacted with the world. And then as I progressed into juvie and to state prison, those lessons literally saved my life. Like, and then to have the state tell me that I'm a violent criminal and that my violence is, that somehow my violence is, was uncalled for, was unnecessary, was wrong. I never understood that because they've never walked in my shoes and they didn't understand how necessary, absolutely necessary violence was in my life. And it's just, when I hear, and I know Dwayne spoke about metrics earlier, and I think that's part of the problem, that the metrics that we use to sort of define when violence is good and when it's bad, or if it's good or if it's bad, it's all skewed. Because if you've never been to prison, if you've never lived the life that I've lived, you wouldn't understand the necessity, the absolute necessity for violence. And it sounds crazy to say, but it's true. And it's true. And it's something that I had to live with, and something I still live with, even at this age where I don't have the need for violence, right? I'm not in prison. I'm not at war with whatever faction, whether it's folks who are incarcerated or the staff or correctional officers or whatever the case may be. I mean, I wrote a piece where, my first interaction in prison, the police tried to kick the correctional officers tried to kick my teeth out, right? Because they tell you to put your hands on the wall. One officer tells you put your hands on the wall. Don't take your hands off the wall for anything. Then another officer will come and say, hey, take your hands down. And if you take your hands down, this is a little game they play, they beat the living crap out of you. And I didn't know, I'm a rookie, so I got my hands on the wall. Don't take your hands down. Cool, no problem. And another officer comes, oh, you good, take your hands down. I took my hands down, and they put me in the hospital. They broke 2 of my ribs. They tried to take my teeth out. They kicking me in my testicles, trying to take my testicles out. And I learned very quickly. I said, oh, this is how the game is played? Okay. And violence was necessary, was absolutely necessary. We had to meet violence with violence. And it was crazy, but it was part of the world that I inhabited, that I inherited, for lack of a better word. So I don't, it's just difficult to sort of, for me to sort of to hear people talk about violence and not have any idea at all, or just how, in some circumstances, how necessary it is, it can be. Anyway, that's just my piece, man. I dropped the mic right there.
Thanks, Ivan. Arabella, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ivan and Dwayne, for everything that you've shared with us. I feel like that has been so informative for us all, and especially for me in thinking more about the issue of abolition. I wonder if a way to think about kind of the differing perspectives that we've heard tonight can be seen through like the lens in Buddhism. They talk about having like multiple layers of truths and like a relative truth versus like an ultimate truth, that people like essentially you can't hear about like this higher level of truth until you've kind of like gone through the process and really like come to understand like the first level. And then once you're there, you're ready to deal with like the more challenging ideas. And I feel like especially like Angela Davis's piece and Professor McLeod's piece I think there is value in kind of laying the groundwork for this more like utopian idea of what abolition could be, expanding understandings of what violence is and how it works, and thinking about like reimagining ways that we can, you know, order society and interact with one another and have different values. But at the same time, I feel like those difficult conversations of like, what do we do about the really violent people, the people who like continue to perpetuate violence? Those questions do seem to be put off in a lot of like abolitionist conversations and like a lot of really radical spaces that really do want to like honor this utopian idea of what abolition could look like. But I think those really challenging ideas do really deserve to be dealt with. And so I really appreciate all the points that Dwayne, you brought into the conversation, because I think those totally need to be like honored and dealt with and thought about, and not just in like an abstract way, but really thinking about how we can like respect the wishes of people who don't want to go through you know, the criminal legal system to deal with their own experiences of trauma, but then also dealing with other people who have experienced trauma and who do feel like dealing with the criminal legal system like would be a way for them to achieve justice.
All right, Dwayne had to jump off, and he sent a message saying that he's got to jump off. He needs to take care of an issue, and he deeply appreciated the conversation. So he had to jump off. I've also got some questions in the question and answer. One of the things is, Jindu, can you put the chat in the chat, the reference to the Ritchie report that you were talking about? There's a lot going on there too. So if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. Cogni, do you want to go next? I've got Cogni, Mayaki, Elias, and then Brandon. And then maybe, so why don't you guys intervene, and then maybe we can go back to Allegra, our special guest, to have some time also. Cogni.
Thank you. I think I actually had goosebumps for the majority of our conversation today, so I really appreciate it. I think one of my major takeaways here is, and maybe this is reductive, it's the idea that you can't predict what justice looks like for somebody. For instance, someone who might actually prefer an idea of revenge or retribution, or quote unquote just desserts, and retaliatory violence in some ways, or on the other hand, the idea that everybody is fundamentally good and will not find the need to cause violence to somebody else. And I suppose I just wanted to hear in general about ways of education, maybe ways of thinking about how do we like sit with the idea of justice, how do we sit with the idea of violence, but also make it workable such that people feel like because I don't think it's intuitive always what might be the ideal form of justice. And I suppose I just wanted to hear how we could maybe help people think through that, help ourselves think through that, because I wouldn't say it's intuitive that I shouldn't necessarily want to cause violence to somebody. I had to be taught that. And so any comments on how that would work as a community building activity would be appreciated. Thank you.
Great, great. Mayaki?
So thanks so much to all the panelists for this really engaging and insightful conversation. One remark by Dwayne that really stuck with me was that, you know, he couldn't and we shouldn't try to guarantee that you know, if someone gets out of prison, that they will then never again, you know, do anything wrong, and presumably that also applies to everyone in society, which made me think of the way in which at times within abolitionist literature there can be a suggestion that, you know, if we transform society in an abolitionist way, then we can have better public safety or near perfect public safety. And in many ways, that's of course true insofar as it'll remove many of the current conditions for violence. But then at the same time, and I think that this was also a large part of what Dwayne was getting at, that there is, you know, a matter of fact that there will always be people, you know, who will do things wrong, and that there will need to be a way of responding to that. So I was wondering whether perhaps the idea of public safety itself should be decentered or deprioritized in the abolitionist movement. Though I also worry at the same time that there also is very much a need to protect people from violence in some way, but that is a tension that I am trying to grapple with, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks, Mayaki. Lias, Brandon, and then Allegra, who will have the final time to make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I, like Cogni, I got goosebumps throughout this whole event so far. I think one thing for me that I sort of wanted to respond to and sort of was curious to engage in more was sort of the distinction that you made, Professor Harcourt, between what one does and what one thinks generally about abolition, with what one does ultimately being most important. That was sort of how you were pushing back on what Dwayne said. But it seems to me that these two things, these two ideas converge on each other, and it can't be denied that sort of the general view ultimately affects action and ultimately affects how people are going to be able to invest themselves in the issues, the quality of contributions, and perhaps also affect the ability to empathize with the deeply complex and less obvious moral, social, and practical aspects of the impacts of a carceral society, but also in the practical aspects of a transition towards abolition, which I think is a lot of the reason why Dwayne's comments had such an impact on us today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks. Thanks, Lias. And I want to say a word about that at the end, maybe. Brandon, and then Allegra. And yeah, we're trying to go to 8:45. So go ahead, Brandon.
Definitely. Thank you all for everything you've said. This has been a really wonderful conversation to be able to listen to. The core question I think that I'm taking away from this kind of came from three different statements, although pulls from many others. First, Ivan's really good at going to the heart of things, as I've seen over the past few weeks, and he said something along the lines of violence is necessary. And that for me paired with something that Jindu said, which was that we want to skip over this pain of abolition and kind of get to what does the end result look like without really looking at this intermediary period. And then the last thing that kind of went with that was something Alexis said, which was bring this public health lens to it. So for me, the takeaway is, or something I would love to get more perspective on is, what does the post-abolition triage look like? And how do we sell that to the 98% of people who are going to be affected outside of the Zoom room?
Great, thanks, Brandon. Allegra, you've got a few minutes to kind of address some of the issues that you might want to think about, and don't forget to turn on your mic.
There's so much more to say than there's time remaining. I'm grateful to have been part of this conversation. I wanted to return to a point first that Salah Ben Habib made. I know Jindu addressed it in part, but I disagree. I think that the call to abolish prisons and police doesn't hurt wealthy people. In my view, police exist primarily to protect the property of wealthy elites, and that's been true from the time of slave patrols up to the present. In wealthy white neighborhoods, when someone calls the police, they respond routinely and expeditiously, and in many other spaces, they won't come, or if they show up at all, it'll be often with violence. And I think that those are important facts to bear in mind. I also think that abolition offers a thick account rather than a thin one, and I wanted to address some of that earlier thread of our discussion. I think W.E.B. Du Bois insists upon both a positive and a negative dimension of abolition. And the positive dimension is a robust account of a social state that's associated with a longstanding Black radical tradition, but so too, and this is part of what I was trying to get at in my remarks, there's also a thick abolitionist tradition of indigenous justice. And it's a distinct tradition and a rich one that we might draw on as we think about what it means to make active amends, what it means to realize accountability. And then so much of this discussion has focused on violence in a particular perspective. And as I said in response to Dwayne, I think it is an important one. However, I also think that indigenous dispossession and genocide are murder, are violence. And I think that the Red Nations Red Deal and the Land Back and other components of that work for indigenous justice is about justice, is about accountability, and is about active amends. And I think it's important that we take that quite seriously and think about violence and that perspective as well. I think the Breathe Act offers a way of thinking deeply and radically about violence. Finally, I guess I will say just a few more words about the piece you read, Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice. And what I had intended to do was not to disclaim it, but rather, just as those to whom I directed some of my critical remarks tonight, to regard that analysis is unfolding largely within the terms the criminal legal system provides us with. And I think we need new terms. And I wish that I had integrated in that analysis, and I hope we will all take seriously going forward those dimensions of abolitionist critique that foreground anti-capitalism, imperialism, and white supremacy. I believe that's important as a historical matter, as a theoretical matter, and as a practical matter. And I'd like to just end by suggesting something of why I think it is both practically as well as theoretically, politically and historically significant. If we understand these other dimensions of the abolitionist project as central, we see that abolition is trying to confront multiple interlocking systems of oppression, and that enables a form of solidarity and work to undo these systems that brings people together across lines of difference and that has tremendous power. And one instance of this is the success that incarcerated people and anti-prison activists had in Kentucky, shutting down a planned prison on a strip mine site, joining people who were concerned about climate justice, the violence of coal strip mining, people who recognize the way in which prisons would decimate those that would fill them, but also those in the adjacent community. And they joined together and put an end to the construction of this prison on a Kentucky strip mining site. And I believe that the potential of understanding these interlocking systems of oppression and understanding abolition in this broader view that I believe to be a thick account of abolition, one with multiple genealogies, is something that has tremendous possibilities in the present and in our future for addressing violence and for helping us to realize a more just world.
Thank you, Allegra, and thanks. We do have to end because it's almost 3 a.m. for Cletus in Ghana, so it's getting kind of late, right? But look, I just wanted to end with one final thought, and it was this: in terms of it is what we do. If you rewind this tape, and if you go back to our earliest discussion with Dwayne Betts, when he was talking about the sweats that he received from his friends and the paper that he made from it. If you just go back to that video spot right there and look at the way he is holding and talking about and looking at those sweats that he received from his friends who were incarcerated, that moment, that's actually what I call abolition, right there. And it's something about, you know, what we do, and I felt it and I saw it right there, and so I really enjoyed this conversation and even in the difficulty of it, and deeply grateful, Allegra, for the way in which you tried to bring it together, and to Dwayne also the way he brought it to us, and to all of you for this rich conversation, and you know, not skirting, right? So really dealing with what I consider to be at the heart of the contemporary, of our necessity in the contemporary to deal with this issue of prison abolition properly and abolition democracy properly, and in part to come back to where we were at the beginning, which is, how do we think about this institution that has been born with its own reform for centuries, and that is interlocked with this continuing idea that it needs to be reformed. Thanks, Allegra. Thanks, everyone. Ivan, Jindu, Alexis, Jocelyn, Arabella, Hedwig, everyone, Mayaki, Cogni, Kadar, Elias, Cletus, Brandon, Sonia, Anita, everybody. Also, I didn't get as well as I should have to the questions, but that were also coming in on the Q&A. But there was so much going on; it was hard to answer it all. All right, so next we meet is on February 25th. Let me put up the slide quickly. We're going to be with Dorothy Roberts, and we are going to be talking about family policing. We're going to be talking about all of the things we were talking about today, about foster homes and juvenile detention centers, and the entire framework that surrounds youth today. So thanks for joining us. Come back on February 25th, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Allegra. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Leas. Thanks so much.